everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right, today's podcast is titled Global Systems Outlook Trends, Risks, and Scenarios. Basically, this is the title of a handbook written by Velina Tchakarova. Velina is the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna, Austria. She conducts strategic foresight and trends analyses for the Austrian Ministry of Defense and is an instructor at the Real World Risk Institute led by the best-selling author Nassim Taleb. Her research work includes researching, consulting, lectures, and publications on global and regional trends. She also looks at future scenarios and geopolitical topics for clients from the public and private sector. She's currently writing a book on the Dragon Bear, which is China and Russia, and its impact on global affairs based on systems thinking, strategic foresight, geopolitics, and geoeconomics. She is also finishing a PhD dissertation on the role of external actors in Eastern Europe, the case of Ukraine, Belarus, Azerbaijan at the University of Vienna. Velina, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure being here today and discussing some of my concepts and main contributions over the last several years.
All right, Velina. So let's start with this. So I read your handbook. First of all, I want to say it was fantastic. I really had a great time reading it. But if we were to start with giving people a basic introduction to the concept of the handbook inside. So when you say global systems, a global system outlook, trends, risks, and scenarios, what exactly are we talking about?
So first, I need to stress that the Global System Outlook was published during the previous US administration, and still, of course, the main trends are in place. We are going to discuss them, but it needs certain updates. And the second thing I would like to stress right in advance is that I'm planning to publish also a collection of geopolitical essays, which in fact updated some of the main ideas of this handbook. Now, the idea of the handbook is just to point to some trends, directions when it comes to the development of the current international relations. Now, I myself am expert in international relations from a realpolitik and geopolitics perspective. And what I've been doing over the last 12 years was to analyze certain trends when it comes to the shifts, the changes in global affairs. And first thing that I noticed was that contrary to the previous periods in international relations where there were cycles of globalization, we have many examples of great powers trying to, of course, impose their understanding of how to rule the world. Contrary to these previous globalization periods, right now we are in an unprecedented one because of two important developments. The first, of course, was the collapse of the Soviet Union as the one superpower challenging the other one, which was the United States. And following the collapse of the Soviet Union, new period of the international relations 30 years ago began, in which the US-led socioeconomic networks, which were part of, of the so-called West, that means, of course, the United States, the American allies and partners all over the world, that this kind of US-led networks were then globalized and basically with very few exceptions, most of the countries in the world became part of these globalized socioeconomic networks. So what came out of this globalization cycle in the 90s was first and foremost what I call a global system, basically encompassing these main networks, be it global economy, global finance, global trade, global energy, global agriculture, global organizations. I mean, I only need to give you the buzzword World Health Organization or World Trade Organization, so you get my point about also global organizations, and you see how an foreseen effect of this globalization cycle that began in the 90s was the result which I called global system, based on the fact that for the very first time in the human history, we are dealing with a global capitalist network. Like I said, most of the countries, no matter the political order, are part of it. And that means, of course, that in the event of, let's say, deglobalization, which is also a very kind of a natural cycle that follows globalization cycles. So, in a case of the globalization cycle, and right now I argue that we are in the midst of such the globalization cycle, this would result, of course, in unforeseen second order effects. And we are already observing some of them. I will also, elaborate on some of these current trends. But in fact, just to conclude, this global system, of course, has been profitable for most of the countries being part of it, but to a different extent. And right now, one of the byproducts of these systemic processes is the emergence of a second system of power. This was also an unforeseen second order effect, because if you look back to the history of the 90s and then the history of the beginning of the new century, of course, China has been almost completely entangled with the United States. And of course, this entanglement, which had also this very technical term mostly by the Wall Street and by investors, the so-called chimerica, namely pointing to a kind of almost complete, win-win situation between the United States and China because of the globalized networks. So this led to the emergence of a second system of power, one that is now very visible in the Indo-Pacific, in the Asian Pacific region, one that is already producing centrifugal forces, and of course. There are a few open questions here. First is, will China manage to translate this emerging system of power into a global power projection? Because still 30 years later, there is only one state actor which has global power projection capabilities, and that is, of course, the United States. However, there are certain signals indicative of the trend that China may also look for options how to translate this geoeconomic cloud that is a result of the globalization, a result of disentanglement, a result of this global system, the way it emerged over the last 30 years, that China is now going to translate this into first, of course, regional power projection, and the main terrains for it would be, of course, the Indo-Pacific, mainly, of course, Strait of Taiwan, Taiwan being, the main target of Chinese geopolitical ambitions, and then, of course, the South China Sea. This is the maritime domain, and there will be also our terrestrial domain, which is mostly the Central Asian and the South Asian realm. And in reality, there are now these several layers which we are simultaneously observing and are struggling to to deal with. The first, of course, is, as I said, even before the pandemic, deglobalization cycle kicked in with a global economic stagnation, with the realization by the United States, and this was already during Obama's administration, that United States can no longer be the main source for China's growing power leverage. And of course, already during Obama's administration, there were efforts to address this systemic issue. Then there is a layer, of course, that, and this is what the handbook mostly addresses, of course, during Trump's administration, another American approach was introduced. Obama's approach is now also basically Biden's approach. This is a very institutionalized American approach to create, to forge basically alliances and partnerships all over the world, to find like-minded um, state actors and also international or regional organizations that collectively deal with the issue. So basically create a counterweight to China's ambitions. But with Trump, another a very national-like, very bilateral-like approach was introduced by the United States to tackle the systemic rival China. And this one meant, of course, that international organizations and even regional organizations more or less were devalued. And what Trump was doing was more to engage on bilateral manner with other states, to put pressure on them also to pick sides. And by saying picking sides, I also want to address another important trend that is now increasingly coming to light, and that is the trend of the role of the so-called mid-sized powers, or what I call, in a very technical in very technical terms, free riders. These are basically the regional actors navigating between United States and China. So basically countries with regional power projection, with important leverage. However, countries trying, of course, to engage economically with China while being strategic partners with the United States in security terms, and by doing so trying to maximize their own gains, because they know if they take sides, this would mean a very binary world for them. And in terms of a binary world, you automatically are excluded from the from the one's networks. So in a sense, this important trend was, of course, amplified during Trump's administration. And even now, with the new administration, we are still observing the developments that are pointing to a very different world than the one in the 90s and the beginning of the century, namely that countries are still trying to be very careful in their positions. And the most fresh example was the war launched by Russia on Ukraine, where even after the invasion, countries were still trying to navigate and position themselves. And final trend, I think very important one, which is going to be relevant for this transitionary period of international relations, is the trend of the modus vivendi that emerged between China and Russia since 2014, and has been amplified specifically over the last few years. Once again, a modus vivendi, not an alliance or an intent, or pick whatever technical term you like to describe a partnership. No Western understanding fits, I think, this fits the real background of this relationship. So I call it a modus vivendi of systemic coordination in the key strategic domains. And these key strategic domains are exactly the same that are relevant for the transitionary period of the global system transformation. That means that both countries realize the necessity to coordinate very close, not just positions, but also actions in the field of economy, trade, defense, energy, agriculture. That means, of course, commodities, raw materials, but also space, international regional organizations. And why? Because they know that if they coordinate their positions, if they actually build a stronger counterweight to American power projection in the world, they can also have better chances to survive this transitionary period in the international relations. They can also navigate better by, of course, still maximizing their own national interests, and of course, they have a plethora of overlapping geographic areas where they can coordinate and benefit from this coordination. I will elaborate on this a little bit later. So take all these important layers, like I said, deglobalization cycle even before the pandemic, amplified by the pandemic in several important areas such as global supply chains reconfiguration, um, decoupling between United States and China in all relevant networks, emergence of a modus vivendi between China and Russia, even following Russia's war on Ukraine, and a kind of uh, huge group of free riders being, so to say, squeezed in between while trying to avoid sites. And I will stop here.
So Velina, I just had one small query. So when you talk about the global system, are you looking at it from a numeric sense, like a Dawkinian sense, where it is? I'm not saying it is exactly an organism, but it is kind of evolving at a constant level, at a multi-layer level, to get it right.
So I look at the global system from the perspective of systems theory and complexity. So if you take a helicopter view at the international relations, you would see certain patterns uh, of behavior, within the international relations, but also you would identify certain interconnections between the main components. If the main components of the global systems are in fact also systems themselves, this would be the global finance, the global capital markets, the global monetary issues, the global energy, the global trade, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And then if you look closer at this component, so it's a very macro perspective of the world. And if you look then at these components, you will identify the networks that are connecting the states. And by identifying these interconnections, by identifying the dependencies, these so-called interdependencies between the states in all these relevant socioeconomic networks, one can actually assess the trend developments in these relationships. So it's a very kind of a neutral approach, a time costly one, of course, to carefully observe all the signals and to try to identify the trends directions. But I do argue that the trends and directions then give you some answers which are not politicized, because they do not depend on this is not a bottom-up approach where you look at the dynamics within the countries and then depending on the party politics of country ABC, depending on party connections between countries ABC, and then depending on the relations between countries ABC, you get to certain outcomes. This, of course, does not mean that the bottom-up approach is not relevant. On the opposite, I only deliver one perspective, and this perspective is not encompassing the whole picture. So if you want to, address and analyze relevant socioeconomic processes within countries, relevant societal changes within countries, my approach on the global system uh, would not be suitable. It would not give you any relevant answers. My approach is actually suitable only for long-term systemic trends and transformational processes, so that you can also identify in advance in which direction, for instance, international relations are going. So to give you two examples, the majority of the pundits and experts and authors of the international relations have been pointing to the emergence of multipolarity since decades. And we were living with this idea of an emerging multipolarity world over the last at least 2 decades. And I remember when I myself was a student, prior to the multipolarity case, this was the case of the end of the history and the beginning of the global liberalism. And, due to the fact that the Cold War was over and the one superpower was gone, and there was only one superpower left, that basically we would be living, in this end of the history scenario, which would mean, spread of democracy and spread of liberalism all over the world. And this was the indoctrination, more or less, when it comes to international relations, for a whole generation of young experts. And this was followed then by the multipolarity thesis. And I was arguing since 2014, given, as I already elaborated, given the fact that we were entering a deglobalization cycle, and given the fact that at the top of the system, there is one current hegemon, if you like, only one state actor can deploy military force whenever in the world, wherever in the world, whenever it wants, and without any, or let's say, without significant consequences. And we observed this kind of behavior over the last 20 years on the side of the United States. But at the top of the system, there is also a challenger right now. There is a kind of a natural process where, actually, thanks to the United States, a second power emerged. But aside from this systemic rivalry at the top of the system, everything else in terms of regional constellations, rivalries, competitions, everything else is taking place at the meta level of the international relations. And if we argue there is a multipolarity, then we will find this multipolarity at the meta level, but not at the top of the level. At the top of the global system, there is only one systemic rivalry. There is only one current challenger of the global order that has the capacities, or maybe not. And as I said, this is an open question mark, because we had the pandemic over the last 2 years, and because the pandemic is still not over. We have a complete reconfiguration of global supply chains. We have a lot of decoupling in all of these socioeconomic networks. We have the trend of the deglobalization per se right now, and we have already serious fragmentation in the international relations. So if China is striving to become this second system pole of the international relations, it will need, of course, partners to do so. It will need the relevant networks to do so. It will need the relevant structures to do so. But aside from that, anything else that would be a kind of a multipolarity is actually taking place only at the level of regions and basically what I call meta level of the international relations, where the so-called free riders are trying to build different ad hoc geopolitical formations. In one of them, they are, for instance, competing, but in another one, they are actually cooperating. I can give you an exact case with the relationship between Russia and Turkey, where they are in fact cooperating in some of the cases, in some of the regions, and at the same time they are rivals over regional power projections in other parts of the world. And this goes for many other bilateral relationships. So I don't buy the whole multipolarity thesis. And I do think that by actually missing the chance to identify the real outcome of these transformationary processes, we also cannot derive the right conclusions for what comes next. I myself have still a lot of open question marks, but I think that some of the trends directions point to already to realities that we may end up with in this decade.
So, Valina, I just maybe we can bring it to something contemporary as what's going on, unfortunately, right now between Russia and Ukraine with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, if I was to look at it again from the global systems perspective that you have propounded in your handbook, so where do you see Pax Americana right now? So, I'll give you an example. So, you just shared an example of Russia and Turkey. Now, without getting into the merits or demerits of what Russia is doing or what Ukraine is doing or how the West or the European Union is responding, because that's not my area of expertise. But I can tell you what I look at it, sitting here as an average consumer of information in India. Uh, there is a certain set of information that stems from news outlets coming from the West. Now, the thing is, in India, we get access to everything, right? So we get access to the Russian side, we get access to the American side, we get access to the European side, and we get access to whatever we can make of from the Ukrainian point of view. But there is a certain set of actions that has been taken by the United States of America and the European Union together, where I don't know which word should I use, and I use it with a lot of caution. But there is a weaponization of big tech also that has happened from the United States of America, where you have certain, let's say, Russian outlets have been banned on YouTube. Russian companies, the SWIFT system decision, and many other decisions like that. Now, in a global world where the entire edifice, which you rightly spoke about, Fukuyama's thesis of the end of the world and stuff like that. Obviously, Fukuyama, I don't know, we can safely say Fukuyama has been pretty much proven wrong in multiple ways. But if we were to look at what's happening right now and we bring it to, what do you make of Pax Americana right now?
Mhm. And that is one of the questions I'm dealing with myself. Like, are we going to end up with Pax Americana 2.0? Or are we going to end up with a bifurcation of the global system, as I argue, or at least I've been arguing for the last 7-8 years following the events, following the launch of kind of a deglobalization cycle, and given also the fact that we are in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution, and you rightly pointed to the big tech problem. And here, once again, I need to stress that the trend is clearly pointing to a systemic rivalry between United States and China in the tech domain, and anything else comes next, but by far not with the same extent and scope as as the technological competition between Washington and Beijing. So once again, fourth industrial revolution, a significant domain of systemic competition between two systems of power. And of course, obviously, the winner of the fourth industrial revolution is likely to be the winner of the systemic competition in general. And why do I say that? Is because if we look back to the history of the previous globalization cycles, and also the history of the previous systemic competitions, like during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, when the third industrial revolution was taking place in the 70s, there was indeed this clear competition between Washington and Moscow and their systems and their geopolitical blocks talks and also defense alliances over the technological breakthroughs. There was the introduction of nuclear energy, and then there was also, of course, the competition over space supremacy. And obviously, United States decided, came out as a winner of this technological competition, which is why now once again there is an open question mark. Is it going to be United States once again together with partners as the next winner of the fourth industrial revolution, or is it going to be Beijing with with partners and with its own geopolitical bloc? This is going to be very much decisive for the direction of the international relations, and also, of course, big tech is being weaponized right now. And of course, you clearly are observing bipolarization in the technological domain. And this is going to remain the case. Next to it, of course, is that what I argue, that if we look at the period between the World War One and the World War Two, I argue that this was a kind of a intermission period between the two world wars, which would be actually which we should consider as one major world war period, and as I said, with an intermission in between. So if we look at it from this perspective, the same can be true also for the period between the Cold War One and now the emergence of the Cold War Two. And my case for the Cold War Two is, in fact, Russia's war on Ukraine, which I think marks the beginning of Cold War Two. So we are not entering a period of a World War Three, as a lot of people were pointing to over the last 2-3 weeks. I argue that this period between the first and the second Cold War was an intermission, was an interruption, so to say. And right now we are entering in the second Cold War II. And in the Cold War II, there will be once again 4 main domains which will be relevant for the systemic competition. It's going to be about, once again, political economy. Political economy is what I've described at the beginning. So all of these relevant trends are to be followed when it comes to the decoupling. And the decoupling, by the way, is happening in fact, on both sides. It's not just that the United States is striving for decoupling from China. It's also that China is, in fact, intensifying decoupling from the United States, for the obvious reason that this interdependence can no longer function in a bifurcated world. The second important domain is what you mentioned, of course, the tech domain. So a lot of competition is going to take place in the technological domain amid the fourth industrial revolution. The third important domain is going to be about rules, standards, norms. So what has been the big discussion in the last years about that this time we are not going to have an ideological component. That's why this is not going to be a Cold War. But I argue that it's going to be an ideological competition as well, because as we see, there are different actors with different understanding of history. They do read history differently. They do interpret history differently, and they also interpret standards, norms, international law norms differently. And the best case right now is, of course, Russia's war on Ukraine, which actually, from a Russian or Chinese perspective, is being interpreted in a very different manner. And I think that this specific domain, when it comes to norms settings, setting, rule setting, and then of course understanding of political order, understanding of how what your relationship is to your own population, how you engage with your population, what kind of means and instruments do you use to control your population. All of this is going to be relevant in this domain. So once again, this is of course a kind of ideological competition, because it is about the hearts and minds of your own population and how you actually create narratives, impose narratives, and also provide support, international or regional, within the national or regional organizations, for your narratives. And then finally, of course, the fourth important domain would be how you manage your partnerships, how you forge your alliances, how do you create actually geopolitical and geoeconomic blocks. And once again, we are clearly observing bifurcation, even in this domain already. Just to give you the example with Australia, which has a very strong geoeconomic clout with China, has a lot of trade and economic ties with China, has in fact sided with the United States and entered the security and defense pact with the United States and Great Britain. In fact, because of China. So I think that, and this is of course one of the few exceptions right now at the regional level, when regional actor with a certain power projection in the region, specifically in the Indo-Pacific, has decided to side with the one of the two systemic competitors. I argue that at some point of time, depending on how accelerated the transformational processes will be, more regional actors will be confronted with a reality where they will have to take either or choices. And right now, of course, each one of them is trying to, slow down these processes. But at some point of time, at the tactical level, oscillation may work. At the strategic level, oscillation never works. So, I mean, between two chairs, the chance that you remain grounded, basically, with less options, is pretty high. So to go back to your question also on Russia's war on Ukraine, I think that the timing of the decision by the Russian president was not coincidental. I think it has very much relevance for what's going on in the world, and he factored in these transformational processes, of course, from a Russian perspective, and what may work for him and for his country. And I think that it was a manifestation of the beginning of the Second Cold War. And of course, we are about to see in the next weeks and months whether this thesis of mine will be validated. But certainly, he factored in the bifurcation of the global system. Certainly, he factored in also China's backing, economic, financial, and in terms of trade. No matter what China has been saying or not saying, no matter how many calls Biden will make with the Chinese president, I argue that still the case for significant support for Russia coming from China is in place, not because of any altruistic reasons, but because of two main factors from a Chinese perspective. The first one being that China fears the United States global power projection most, and by backing Russia, China keeps the United States busy in Europe. And that means, of course, that America will, it will take time for America to shift its focus on the Indo-Pacific, where, in fact, I argue the main American power projection is going to take place in this decade. And second, of course, is that for China to become a successful global competitor, there is this terrestrial dimension, which is equally important from a geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective, and that is the terrestrial dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative, which
Yeah.
is mostly a terrestrial connectivity in Eurasia and in South Asia. And for doing that, China needs Russia. China cannot be successful heartland power without the backing of Russia. So Putin has factored in this as well. But Putin is also factoring in increasing tensions between China and India. And once again, it's not going to be the United States, but it's going to be Russia that is going to somehow mediate and try to facilitate between them in order to, scale down the military component of this confrontation. But it's just a matter of fact. It's just a matter of time. In fact, even in 2022, I would actually anticipate military tensions between China and India. And of course, what he has been also factoring in is the American retreat from specific regions, one being the Middle East, and second in the long term being Europe, because as I said, America does not want to deal with Europe anymore. America actually wants to deal with the Indo-Pacific and with East Asia. And I think that given this background, of course, given also tactical developments, which I can also address later, this led to the decision to launch a full-scale war on Ukraine.
This is fascinating because sitting here in India, so when New Delhi sees the weaponization, like I spoke about, of big tech, it scares a lot of people because it's a very simple thing, right? If they could do it to Russia, they could do it to me. It's a very simple mindset. Human beings, at the end of the day, are reactionary animals. Also, uh, about obviously, what I see when I look at foreign policy or international affairs is, yes, there is a lot of talk about value-based systems and value-based orders and worldviews, but I honestly, if one peels the layers away, I see a lot of transactionalism when it comes to foreign policy. So America might you could have a Jen Psaki coming on the White House correspondence press conference and saying, "Oh, it's not really good if India buys oil from Russia at a cheaper rate because the Russians are giving an offer." But not even once would the Americans, let's say, chide Europe, for that matter, Germany, who has significant, energy dependence on Russia, and they're clearly not stopping it even when the war is going on. It's quite clear. It's clear as daylight. So it creates very interesting scenarios. But having said that, when it comes to China, India would need the assistance and the support of America, whether Indians want to admit to it or not publicly. I don't know about that. I mean, I don't see any problem admitting to it. In fact, at a very personal level, I've never really had a problem with Pax Americana myself, because I'm someone who kind of believes that the world is always going to have, albeit in a soft way, some sort of a policeman. And if the policeman, if I was to select the policeman, I mean, I don't know how to say it. India was never going to be that policeman. India had its own issues. And I am saying this. I'm not saying you're saying this. So before somebody jumps on this, it's me who's saying it, not you. I always was comfortable with America being the policeman because from a value-based perspective, I always were more comfortable with liberal democracies in comparison to, let's say, the Chinese model or the Russian model. But having said that, we are entering into this multipolarity where it's almost as if it's so confusing. At one spot, Russia needs China, but then the Russians also need India because we are one of their biggest purchasers when it comes to arms and ammunition. At one spot, India might need America, but India at the same time needs Russia because 60% of our artillery or our defense equipment is from Russia. So, in the scenario where there is some sort of a military conflict that India has, we don't want to be in a situation where, we don't get any kind of assistance in terms of backup from the Russians. So it's kind of confusing. At the same time, I think the Indian Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, does realize the problem of relying too much on others. And I don't know if you've heard about this Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar Bharat means self-sufficient, right? That's the whole movement of the current government. And when they talk about indigenization, they don't talk about closing yourselves to the world. What they're talking about is weaning yourself away from the world. And the right word you said was decoupling. Basically, you don't rely on anyone, and you create these transactional relationships with everyone, literally. So in that situation, Velina, who gains in the Russia Ukraine war in the end? Does America gain? Does China gain? Does Russia gain? Does India gain? Because I don't know what's happening out there. To be very honest, I'll be the first one to admit, I literally go on social media. If you read European news, Ukraine is resisting, Russians are dying. You go on Russian sources, Russians are winning, they're going in, they're going in, they're going in. I have no clue what the truth is. I mean, I have literally got no idea what's happening. And I'm just sitting here and I'm like, people are so confident about these things when, as someone who just asks questions, my only question is, how can people be so confident then?
Yes, and I'm not confident as many people tend to be. I just try to make sense of all that is happening from a strictly realpolitik geopolitical perspective. And once again, I stress this is not encompassing the whole picture. This is not telling you the whole story. This is only one side of the way we look at the world and international relations. And I do not argue that this is should be, should be the only relevant side that needs to be considered. But in my case, from my professional experience, it helped me a lot to identify in advance, or let's say in a in a better time framework, um, when it comes to the systemic processes. So in a sense, I see myself more as a climate than a weather expert. And because you are now asking me a question that is relevant for the weather, like today is cold but tomorrow is going to be warm, and I can, of course, I will try to give you an answer, but from the perspective of a climate expert looking at the long term trends, and not the
Absolutely.
tactical, because war is war. And of course it can have u-turns, unexpected u-turns, and we cannot factor in this particular u-turns or shifts in the warfare. And second, of course, because there are so many layers that entail information we don't have. So we only have the open source information, and of course the two sites are, of course, shaping the informational space. To the point that they, of course, need to create an advantage for them, which is understandable for domestic consume, but also for the consume of their international partners. Now, let me try to summarize it from from my very tiny angle from which I'm looking at the world. As I said, once again, and I want to stress, the timing is not coincidental. I was absolutely convinced already in December that we are going to witness a military reinvasion by Russia, and this is going to happen after 20th of February, after the end of the Olympics. All of this is actually, available. All of this analysis and assessment is available. What I got wrong is that uh, the final outcome of this reinvasion should be a complete subjugation of Ukraine by Russia. And I saw this in a time frame of 10 to 15 years. So in a sense, I was anticipating a military attack, which with limited scope and limited time frame, starting after 20th of December of February, and the military operations in all of Ukraine. So basically, a full-scale war was launched on 24th of February. So what I try to say is that the Russian president decided to go all in on Ukraine and to make a move on Ukraine in once. So in by actually attacking the whole of Ukraine. And analyze and assess these developments as part of something bigger than just the relations between Russia and Ukraine. The Russian president is seeking to upgrade the position of his country in this global transformational period of the international relations. He's trying to upgrade the position of Russia between China and United States. And in order to succeed, in order to have a better positioning, to have a, so to say, pole position, placing himself in the role of which China was in the 70s, basically. That would mean that neither United States nor China would be able to win a systemic competition against each other without the participation of Russia. So, in order to succeed in this, he needs a bigger geopolitical project. And this would include Belarus. Belarus is already under Russian control. Putin basically saved the Belarusian president Lukashenko following the protests after August 9, 2020, when he actually, he actually went against his own population, and without the interference of Russian president, he would not have remained in power. And meanwhile, there are Russian troops. There will be probably Russian bases, and in future maybe even Russian nukes being deployed in Belarus. So Belarus is already under control, but he needs Ukraine. He needs Ukraine not just because of his historical assets he has been publishing. Putin needs Ukraine as, in order to unify, as he puts it, the Russian, Belarusian and Ukrainian people as being one people in his mindset, and also to use the territory. It's a huge country. That would mean that if he succeeds, he will end up being the largest and most powerful European state on the old continent. And that would, of course, mean bordering directly the European Union, having nukes being deployed directly at, on the border of the European Union member states. And of course, that would mean a completely new equilibrium of the European security order, where he sees himself in the position of imposing the new rules of the game in Europe. And of course, if we look at these calculations, also from the perspective of being the junior partner of the Dragon Bear, obviously a relationship which is asymmetrical, and obviously Russia is already being described by everyone as a junior partner in this Dragon Bear relationship. But even then, if we look at it from this perspective, a junior partner of the Dragon Bear, which is allowed to redraw the maps in Europe and impose new rules of the security architecture in Europe, is of course still a powerful player in the old continent. And as I said, from a Chinese perspective, it would mean also that he would keep the West busy for a long period of time. Now, if you look at from the Ukrainian perspective, actually, a full-scale war has been anticipated by the advisors of the Ukrainian president, at least for the last few years. And in reality, the only option for Ukraine to actually sustain this was, of course, a cooperation with NATO. Cooperation does not mean membership, because nobody was expecting Ukraine to become a member. But the very fact that Ukraine is sustaining successfully, in fact, a full-scale war by Russia, already 21 days, is in fact due to the help of the Western countries. And in reality, even though that Ukrainian elite knew that there will be no membership by NATO, the only option for them was still cooperation with the West in order to gain as much in military terms, in terms of training, and in terms of course, ammunitions and defense weapons from the West in order to sustain a full-scale war. Because the alternative of full-scale war from a Ukrainian perspective is a subjugation, a complete subjugation of a sovereign country by another one. Basically, if Ukraine loses the war, it would mean that there will be no Ukraine on the European map. There will be no sovereign country called Ukraine on the map. So it's actually not just a struggle, but it's a war over the very existence of a sovereign country. So you see how precarious the situation is, also from a European perspective, because right now the European powers, without the American hard power, are in fact not capable of preventing any military attacks by Russia on the old continent. They are reacting to the military operations in Ukraine, in the whole of Ukraine, because, as I said, Russia attacked from all sides, not just in the east of Ukraine. So basically, the European powers, what they are doing right now is, in fact, to react to to Russia's war by introducing severe sanctions, but they were not able to prevent it from happening. And this, of course, may have a serious psychological effect also on the global power equilibrium, in a sense that kind of a geopolitical irrelevance is emerging when it comes to the old continent, specifically when it comes to the old continent. Even though that they are now coherent in their position, even though that they are now cooperating, I still fear that the result of this war may also mean geopolitical irrelevance for the European powers. And in a sense, if these trends continue, Europe may turn in something what I call a geopolitical backyard of the international relations. Now, of course, to go back to what you correctly pointed out, in the first 10 days of the war, European Union powers have traded oil and gas and coal with Russia in the amount of almost and actually more than 9 billion euro. So you see that, in fact, European powers were also co-financing the war of Russia against Ukraine because of this interdependence, as you rightfully pointed out. So in a sense, of course, now they do realize they need to cut this interdependence, but geopolitical analysts like myself were actually pointing to the need to cut these interdependencies already 10 8 5 years ago, because if you are too dependent only on one supplier, you put yourself in the position where you will be politically affected by this player. And of course, you mentioned the example of India, and here once again there is a similar discussion about self-reliance, or we call it strategic autonomy, or strategic sovereignty. These kind of debates are right now taking place also on the old continent. We have also similar debates in the United States. And this is, of course, very much linked to the decoupling and the deglobalization thematic. So in a sense, I argue that the relevant regional great powers are going to further accelerate the trends of not so much self-reliance, because in an interconnected world, it's impossible to be, to cut off ties to the rest of the world. But what we are going to increasingly observe is reconfigurations of supply chains, reconfiguration of commodities relationships, depending on the trust and of course the scope of interdependence with third countries. And here I see a huge potential actually for Europe and India, given
Yeah.
the trends I identified. Why do I see a potential? Because both India and the European Union, in fact, are striving for a third way. They do not want to be affected by the bifurcation. They do not want to take sides. India mistrusts the United States for obvious reasons, and also the European Union does not want to define China as a security threat. And a third way would be a kind of a probably similar development to the non-alignment development in during the Cold War. So in a sense, Europe and India could come together if they in fact manage to somehow overcome the what you described also correctly, these value-based definitions, and in fact are more realistic about the future potentials, and also more realistic about their role in the world.
Yeah, in fact, in your even in your handbook, you talk about if I remember, it was on page 21. It was convergences with many and congruence with none. And I agree with you. I think the as far as the global world is concerned, I think that is the future of the world. Um, I don't know. At times when I listen to politicians talking about values, and I mean, even a novice who knows a little bit of history would know. What are you talking about? That's the reaction. And it applies to India too, by the way. I mean, everybody, there are no, to use the term, holy cows in foreign policy, right? Everybody, I'm not a moral relativist. I believe the Western value structure and Western values are something that are very closer to what we in India have in terms of value structure. So beyond the point, I don't believe that India would ever have beyond a certain level, a very antagonistic relationship with the West. But yes, the Western preaching, especially from the American side, does get to the Indian side, and I think the Indians need to let the Americans know in is as polite a way as possible that, listen, we're not going to listen anymore. If you're going to say something, we're going to tell you off again. But maybe we can now get into the latter half of the discussion, and I want to maybe we can explore 2 3 more areas and conclude our chat. But I was wondering, so you did talk about Europe as a cumulative entity. Now that fascinates me, because even inside Europe, right? So let me put it to you like that. So we obviously, everybody, a good friend of mine, recently on the podcast spoke about this point, and I kind of agreed with him. People often talk about Orientalism, right? So my friend said that we should also talk about Occidentalism. So I'll let you know where we come from, right? So everybody seems to have this opinion on the Orient, and it's from a prism of the West, and the West is trying to understand the former colony from a Western prism, and it's not trying to understand the former colony on the terms set by the colonized itself. Similarly, at times that the former colony looks at the West, and the term the West is bandied about very loosely. It's almost as if everything is the West. So Australia is the West, New Zealand is the West, the Western Europe is the West, America is the West, Canada is the West. But these are distinct nations and distinct cultures. There are, I mean, as someone who has traveled a little bit around the world, it is quite clear that the Germans have a different value structure on many things in comparison to the French or the British. Now, you spoke about Europe as an entity. Now, so what are those common interests then? Is the Europe now? If we look at England, for example, the United Kingdom has clearly left the European Union, right? And for whatever reasons, Brexit has happened. I don't want to get into whether they were good or bad, because that's for some other discussion. But I'm just talking about what has happened in sense. Now, if we look at it, so how does Europe look at the world? Because obviously NATO, then the whole alliance was all about security, right? Post World War, the deal was cracked that, okay, we, the big brother in this relationship, are going to be protecting you. Now obviously Trump comes in and throws sets the cat amongst the pigeons and says, "Oh, NATO is a useless, toothless body. NATO can't do this. NATO can't do that. They need to pay up more," or stuff like that. But even if I was to ask you, when we talk about Europe, what exactly is Europe? Then what binds it? Then.
Mhm. First, before I elaborate on that, I want really, it's important to me to stress one more thing about values, because you also pointed to an important issue, and that is that it's often misunderstood, in fact, within Europe, and also I would argue within the transatlantic alliance, that what actually defines the societies within, in terms of values and norms, should be applied to other societies and to other political and economic and social systems in the world. And I argue that this is a wrong approach, that in fact, from a realpolitik point of view, your values-based society needs to be strengthened in, from your understanding, but it is an inwards process, not outwards process, and you should never project your own values on others. And of course, it has worked. In fact, I mean, this values-based international order, as it's being described by many, has in fact only worked because of American hard power. And with declining American hard power, with withdrawal of United States from various parts of the world, which is going to continue as a trend, by the way. As I said, Middle East is the next to come. We are already observing, by the way, regional constellations in the Middle East because of this trend. So I argue that with the declining interest of United States to be everywhere in the world, also this rules-based order will get affected. And in a sense, what I've been personally arguing here in Europe is that a values-based approach can never be applied to the relations with other partners and with other countries, but it is always to be, it needs to be a realpolitik approach, in a sense that you have clear interests and the counterpart has clear interests, and you need to, find each other somewhere in between. And a very fresh example is what United States did with Venezuela. I mean,
Mhm.
the moment when things started getting messy on the global oil markets, they went to Venezuela to actually cut deals, so that Venezuela can provide for the missing Russian oil on the global markets because of the surging oil price. So you see clearly that this is in a dissonance. And societies in the West are often being presented with the picture that democracies do not wage wars, but in reality, democracies, in realpolitik terms, democracies wage equally as many wars as non-democracies. It's just that democracies wage less wars between each other, which was also, the core idea of let's make more democracies in the world so that we have less wars. But in reality, the number of wars, military conflicts, as we are being told, hasn't become less in the international relations. And I argue that we are going to witness, unfortunately, even more military conflicts and tensions in this transformational period of the international in the international relations. Now, let's go back to your question. What is Europe? First, there is a trend already within the West, which is a kind of fragmentation trend that worries me a lot. But I still need to point it out, and that is that the West is bifurcated itself in a sense that there is an Anglosphere group of Western countries, and then there is the European continental group of countries. When it comes to security and defense relations, when it comes to the approach to China, when it comes to the approach to Russia, and I suppose when it comes to also the Indo-Pacific, we are going to observe an increasingly fragmented West. And in this within this fragmented West, United States with mostly Anglosphere countries, that will be Great Britain, Australia is such case, and I think that there will be also a place for India within this Anglosphere family. For instance, the quadrilateral format is such an example where India is already cooperating with the United States, Japan, and Australia. They are also conducting military drills. It's a non-institutionalized approach, so it's still not to be compared with AUKUS between UK, Great Britain, Australia, and the United States. But still, I think that the trend is quite clear. Japan is going to be a relevant player. South Korea, you see that this is a Anglosphere approach to security and defense that is not being shared by the rest of Europe in to great extent. And the rest of Europe, mainly led by the French, German engine of European integration. So this is the family of the European Union member states, right now 27. There are also member candidates, mostly in the Western Balkans. In this particular part of Europe, where in the 90s there were actually the Balkan Wars, following the collapse of Yugoslavia and the dissolution of Yugoslavia. And all of these countries are now on en route to becoming members of the European Union. And then there are also 6 Eastern European countries that are between the European Union and Russia, which are also trying to navigate between both relevant regional actors. Some of them, like Ukraine, are also part of European Union programs, for instance, to get integrated into the common market. And in a sense, of course, this continental body is going to witness a further integration in specific areas, being probably even we may end up with something that will look like a defense union if the countries within remain coherent. Now, there would be also the danger, even though that right now it does not look like that, because all of them are very very much united. But given the Anglosphere trend, we may end up with a situation where there will be a dividing line within the European Union along the geopolitical interests of the United States, but also the actions of other relevant regional actors such as Turkey or Russia, which are increasingly active on the old continent and specifically in the direct neighborhood to the south and the east of the European Union. And countries such as the Central and Eastern European countries are in fact still convinced that the only security guarantee for their territorial integrity and for their existence comes from the United States and not from the European Union. So obviously there will be a big conflict, I think, in the future when it comes to how the French-German engine is going to overcome these conflict lines. Now, there is an interesting trend also when it comes to the relations of Europe with third partners. I mentioned one example with India. A lot has been achieved in the last 2 years. Unthinkable watershed moments if we look back to the previous periods. Just to give you one example, the very fact that the European Union even relaunched the free trade agreement with India, which was
Mhm.
put on hold in 2013, and free trade agreement with India is actually much higher in the hierarchy of trade relationships with third countries than the current comprehensive agreement on investment with China that the European Union
Exactly.
also put on hold. So you see that even in this very important framework with third countries, India is put much higher in the hierarchy in terms of importance than China. But it's interesting that because you mentioned some of the societal trends and the way how people are now trying to also open up to various concepts that were a taboo or were basically westernized. And I see, even from that perspective, a kind of a unforeseen potential for Europe, because right now, for instance, take Africa, for example, our direct neighbor. There are logical connectivities between Europe and the African continent. The African continent is going to witness immense demographic and economic growth, and Europe could be a direct facilitator of a lot of connectivities. But right now, what is happening actually on the ground is that European powers are being squeezed and are withdrawing from Africa. The buzzword French presence in Mali. The French ambassador was expelled. A lot, the European operation and missions were, and basically the European presence has been also squeezed by other relevant regional actors. And once again, we are in a cycle of regional adversary in Africa, in Asia, and even in Latin America. So once again, you see that the one actor that is not acting as a geopolitical actor is Europe. And in a sense, a lot of these countries, for instance, from Central Asia, they are from Africa, examples from Africa, but also from Latin America, will be likely reaching out to Europe because of the fact that it's no longer a geopolitical actor, or it has actually never been a geopolitical actor as a collective institutional actor. And France and Germany, I actually argue that none of the European powers right now, except probably for Great Britain, and to some extent for France, which is also an Indo-Pacific actually actor, but none of the rest have the means, have the potential, or have the capacities to act as a geopolitical actor in the world, which is also being translated into the fact that the European Union, with all this relevant geoeconomic clout, is in fact no relevant geopolitical actor. And that creates, of course, additional centrifugal forces in this global power equilibrium. And in a sense, there may be a potential for a bigger role, exactly because of the absence of geopolitical competition coming from Europe in the future. But we will see. I mean, everyone else is already there. China, Russia, Gulf states, India is trying to also enter the African continent, and to reach out Central Asian countries, and of course reach out the Middle East. So in a sense, this is a kind of a very fluid geopolitical situation right now, consisting of so many different constellations, and it's hard to get the whole picture because of it.
So, one last question, Melina. Would you say it's safe to assume that the future of Pax Americana actually depends a lot now on the result of the Russia-Ukraine war cry or the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
The future of Pax Americana depends first and foremost on the way how the United States will tackle the competition with China. It does not depend directly on the outcome of Russia's war on Ukraine, but it can be significantly affected. I mean, if the modus vivendi between China and Russia deepens, as I anticipate, if China, as I also anticipate, if my thesis gets validated, this relationship will deepen in the technological domain, in the domain of political economy, in the domain of norms, standards, and regulations, and also in the domain of regional alliances. They will increasingly shape the relations with Central and South Asian countries, but also with Middle Eastern powers. And this, of course, will create a heartland counterweight to American global power projection. In a sense, this would also mean that a kind of a new Iron Curtain will be drawn in Europe, of course, with Ukraine once again, if Russia is successful with the war on Ukraine, this would also mean, of course, that Russia would become or will emerge as a bigger geopolitical actor in this particular area. You know, this would be a vertical expansion of geopolitical and geoeconomic interests, starting from the Arctic, moving from the Arctic through the Baltic countries. This is the so-called NATO eastern flank, which is the western flank of Russia, going through Eastern Europe. Right now, this is, of course, Ukraine, but this is also Southern Caucasus, the Caspian, the Black Sea, the Central Asian countries in Eurasia. So a lot of connectivities, basically from coming from China, go through this terrain and will be under Russian control or under Russian facilitation, and then moving forward to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, the Middle East, and then going through Africa, where Russia has been also striving to build military bases in some African countries. And from there, once again, if successful, of course, Russia would get an access to the Indian Ocean and will suddenly be also present in the Indian Ocean with a relevant role for this decade in the Indo-Pacific. On the other side, of course, what United States would be increasingly doing is actually engaging with mostly Anglosphere countries and partners in the Indian Ocean, in the South China Sea, in East Asia, so basically in the Indo-Pacific terrain, and trying to create more pressure on China in these concrete areas. And then once again, I don't see really a big role for Europe, however, a very significant role for India, and how India is going to manage this increasing Indo-Pacific great power competition. Here, for instance, I think that right now United States needs India more in in this Indo-Pacific region, then India needs the United States when tackling China
China.
in its direct neighborhood. But this equilibrium may change as well. So in a sense, it is going to be more obvious for all of us that it's either a kind of a binary world that we will be living, a kind of a bifurcated global system, and that will of course have a lot of repercussions in terms of how to manage this coexistence, because obviously there is no interest in direct military confrontation between the systemic rivals. This has to be very clear right from the beginning. They do not want to engage in a direct military confrontation, but this was also the case between the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War. However, we will end up with a lot more proxy wars, a lot more military tensions, with the indirect backing of the systemic rivals. And this is what is happening right now also in Ukraine. I mean, even though that China is, of course, denying all these allegations. So in a sense, it depends a lot on the outcome. It depends also a lot on the outcome of these trends. They point to one direction, but given, of course, also the fact that China is now struggling a lot with economic growth, is still in a COVID zero policy. That means a lot of lockdowns, scale down productivity, rising inflation, and so on and so forth. Given also the fact that the political elite in China around Xi Jinping is probably also going to be further in a kind of a conflict when it comes to the future direction of China. A lot open question marks remain. We need to be clearly to observe the trends, and we need to also be aware of the fact that we may end up with one or other scenario. The way I see it, Pax Americana 2.0 right now is still very much the case, given the most severe sanctions that were introduced on Russia, but also given the repercussions that we are already feeling, all over the world, given the interdependence of the global system. But on the other side, also we should be aware of this bifurcation trend, and then of course, what I think is going to be very important is how fast India is going to grow. India has been projected to become the third world's economic power. And if this is going to be the case, it will very much depend also on India's positioning in the global affairs, given the speed, the scope of its geoeconomic cloud in this decade.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes for very interesting times ahead. No, as we say, we can only give our estimates and guesstimates about what's going to happen in the future. We never really can't say with certainty. And as it famously says about the butterfly effect, one flipping of the butterfly creates a tsunami somewhere in the world. So we never know in reality what's going to come, but we can only make educated guesses. Velina, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you. It's always good to get a different perspective, albeit a European perspective, because sitting in India, sometimes we tend to get only the American or the Russian view. So it's actually, for a change, it was really nice to hear the European perspective. So thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for this invitation. It was a great pleasure discussing some of my concepts and trends assessments with you.
All right, guys, we're going to wrap this podcast up. Before we wrap it up, just to let you know, whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're going to be listening to the audio only version, if you go to the description of the podcast, I have left the link of Velina's website. Just go and click there, and you can buy this handbook, which is the title of the podcast. I would urge all of you to buy the handbook, and she offers a lot of other courses and classes too. I would highly recommend all of you to go and check it out. Also, you can follow Velina on Twitter, and if you like what I do over here, please subscribe to the channel, like the video. Also, go and subscribe on Spotify or iTunes, wherever you listen to the podcast, and support the podcast on Patreon or whatever other menus you have. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste, take